we'll get started just a couple minutes after 11 here in Seattle, so we'll move forward. So yeah, I want to welcome everyone to PK's webinar on accelerating outcomes with API governance. And before we get started with today's presentation, I just wanted to remind everybody that all of our attendees are, of course, muted. Our presentation today will be recorded, and we always encourage all attendants to get involved in today's webinar, including any kind of questions that you might have. Please pop them in the Zoom Q&A tool. So for the moment, I'd like to now introduce today's presenter, Lou Powell, PK's head of API enablement.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks everybody for joining today. Hopefully we can give you some great insights into thinking about how to mature and govern your API program to accelerate business outcomes. So we'll go through a short presentation today. I don't like them to be too long, and then afterward, I would absolutely encourage you to ask questions, or if you're thinking it, someone else is too. So there are no silly questions. So if you've got something that you'd like to get out there, I'd love to have a conversation with you. So let's get going. Okay, so the first question that I would ask before we start talking about governance is the perspective that you come at it from. So what is the objective of your API program? So when we look at it, we find that a lot of folks have different objectives, and when they're trying to govern, they're just looking at, infrastructure type governance, or they're looking at compliance type governance, but they're not thinking about driving the value that the business really needs to get from the program, with all of those things married together in how you go about governing. So when we think about API programs as a whole, these are the perspectives that we bring. It's that a good API program, if it's doing its job, creates capability democratization, and it creates consumer independence. And these are the gold. This is where the value is. When you're able to do these two things, then you're able to gain so many benefits. So let's crack them open real quick. So capability democratization, what is that? It's when everybody has the ability to access the capabilities that your company uses to conduct business on a daily basis without having to go through gatekeepers. It means those things are readily and easily available to you. So that's great. And I hear a lot of folks talk about the value of democratizing their capabilities and using APIs as a primary way of accessing those. But that alone is not good enough, because if I give you access to something, but it's not usable, or it doesn't solve my problem, or I still have to have a group of technologists to explain to me the black box experience and how to use it, then you really haven't liberated that capability so that it can be used throughout the enterprise to accelerate delivery. So democratizing is step one, but the second piece of that story is consumer independence. And that is the idea that we've built things in such a way that they are answers to the consumer's problem, meaning we built it to solve a problem that our consumers have when they try to interact with us. And we made it available to them to discover, to understand it, to test it, to requisition it, and to get support and go live, ideally with no human interaction or with minimal human interaction. So when you can have someone find an API that they're looking for to conduct business, whether that's someone inside the enterprise or a partner or a customer or a consumer on the outside, when they can find that capability, they can test it and say, yeah, that's what I'm looking for. They can get a test key, they can start building their stuff, and then they can go live. They do that in a couple of days. That creates an enormous amount of value to the organization. And these are the places that those benefits are realized. One, it accelerates delivery. So it accelerates by making data more easily accessible. You don't have to build something, it's already available and ready to use. It allows you to get products into the marketplace faster and answer those questions. So you start to see all kinds of ways that you're accelerating the ability to put products into the marketplace. And if you're productizing the right capabilities, then many of the most important things you're trying to do can be done can be built in a democratized fashion. You can accelerate that delivery. The second piece of that is innovation. And a lot of times we find that access to capabilities, critical capabilities, is something that is an inhibitor to innovation, that companies only have so many resources that can work with innovation teams to make those capabilities available. And when you have to make choices, you can only do a few. But what if all of the capabilities that you're looking to innovate on top of are already available? They're democratized and they're consumer independent. Then you can do as many innovations as you can afford. I mean, you can innovate on everything that you're thinking of. So this really cracks open that idea of liberating innovation. And the next thing you find is that when we do things in this fashion and we start to productize our capabilities, we reduce the number of instances of that capability. We actually get more secure. We remove dozens of representations with single variant representations, and we're able to protect that variant in a much more intentional way. So by getting more organized around our consumers' capabilities, we're actually creating more secure environments. And then the last thing is resource efficiency. You know, by making these things consumer independent and democratized, we now are freeing up all of those resources that we used to use for explaining how to use our interfaces. So you've got all of these, you know, really smart technology folks and business process folks that are sitting around every day teaching people how to use your interfaces. What if your interfaces were self-evident and you could take all of those resources and get them working on generating new value in the organization? That is huge, because IT resources are so hard to come by and they are so critical in creating those new capabilities. So here's a couple of places where we've seen this play out at PK. Working with Humana, we helped them productize their integration with their brokers, and they only had about 3, and that was about all they could get done in a year because of resource constraints and the complexity of the APIs. So we helped them redesign their APIs to be appropriate to the consumers and the job they were trying to do, and then we documented them and put them in a portal. We worked with the customers to ask them if it made sense to them and to tailor the design to their use cases. And then we published them. In the next year, Humana was able to onboard 42 brokers onto the system with very little interaction. It was almost self-service. So that is the power. And by the way, that represented an enormous amount of new revenue to them. So this is the power of democratization and consumer independent products. Another one is we worked with one of the nation's largest agricultural retailers, and they work with a lot of downstream partners. And what they used to do was integrate into those partners each with a bespoke integration. And they'd get a team together and they'd discuss how do we integrate, and they'd build everything and they'd integrate it into their retail system. We worked with them to develop a set of APIs that were integrated into their retail system that would satisfy the common needs of their downstream partners that they used for producing their products. And after we finished building this, they were able to onboard, I think to date, they're at something like 15 downstream producers onto this process. And they took it from a 3-month to a 4-month integration project into 1 week of the partner integrating and pushing orders into their system. So this was a huge success story at liberating innovation and being able to onboard new partners. Again, decreasing the amount of resources they needed to use to do this, and then also getting those new products, since the integration could happen so quickly, into their retail system 3 to 4 months quicker, and realizing the new value and the new revenue from those products. So API governance is a way of making sure all this happens, right? So when we think about API governance is a broad concept that's focused on the secure and reliable delivery of consumer independent APIs for high value democratized capabilities, meaning we govern the things, the processes, the availability, the security of the things that are providing high value to our organization. And that's the objective of our governance process. So what are we thinking about when we govern? And I've seen governance programs that cover most of these, and I've seen some that cover some of these, but we've never come to a company before we started consulting with them and saw them covering all of these. But we think that governance should cover design, because design impacts compliance and behavior and usability. Operations. So when we look at it, we say you need to be understanding of high availability and resilience and scalability and the number of points of presence and all of the aspects of the system that are going to make sure that we're satisfying the demand that's driving the value in our company. We need to look at performance. You know, are we hitting the response times? Are we caching? Where are we caching? How are we caching? How are we managing that? Productization. So yeah, I've said that several times, but when we think about it, productization is solving my customer's problem, not giving my customer my thing. So when we productize things for our customers, you know, how are we doing that? Are we orienting correctly? Are we packaging correctly? Are our products self-service consumable? Are we testing that to ensure that we're being successful? So how do we package and create a process that allows for those things to happen naturally in the process, right? So how do we allow, you know, dozens of teams, or for some of our customers, hundreds of teams, when they're building thousands of APIs to do these things, to build things in a productized fashion without hitting a governance bottleneck in the organization. Security is absolutely a concern. So we look at, you know, the transport model, the threat models, authorizations, access to accounts, all of those things, and the principles behind how we build things, and then compliance, EULAs, legal instrumentation, regulation, design patterns, and audits. So all of these things are baked into the concerns of building a good governance program, and they're all baked into different areas of the governance. So one of the keys for us when we crafted our governance program was being agile. It was, how do we create a governance program that not only does things in a more contemporary way, but actually allows us to accelerate our ability to deliver without compromising, you know, security or creating higher risk. So how do we lower risk and accelerate at the same time? So we have this concept of being agile, and what we look at is creating API governance that accelerates safety at speed and gives you the right process and the right oversight for the right requirements. And that is something that we're pretty passionate about. We've implemented it dozens of times and found it to be wildly successful in enterprise, you know, in very, very large, you know, Fortune 50 enterprises and everything in the Fortune 500 area. So this isn't something that just works for really, really big organizations. But when you can take these principles and shift the way that you think about governance, then you can truly start to create efficiency and acceleration. So this is one of the key concepts to how we govern APIs, and it's this idea of a categorization framework. And when we think of a category, we're talking about a collection of things that have common attribution. So the categories that we think about are oriented around audience, data sensitivity, the use of the API. So we think about things like, you know, is this an API that's being built internally for app architecture cleanliness, for a team who's building microservices and they've got a number of APIs, but all of them are being consumed locally? Because how they build those, when they've got clear line of sight into what they're being used for in the back-end implementation, their experience and how they're being used and the risk is very different than something that would be, let's say, a PHI or a PII API that's being used outside of the enterprise to integrate with partners. You would look at that and say, okay, now we're exchanging outside of our boundaries of our enterprise, and we're exchanging with partners, and that API is going to be available, even though you have to authenticate, it's going to be available at the edge. So now we've got a lot more concerns. We've got concerns about how we're encrypting and how we're authenticating and how we're making sure that the things that encrypted or that authenticated user wants to do are permissible. and how we've constructed the API to be self-evident to that external partner versus that internal team. So you can see how when you start looking at the difference in the type of data that we're managing and who's building it and where it's being used and how it's being used, that we can come up with several categories that will change the rules of engagement and what needs to be governed for those types of APIs, which allows us to build this structure of just in time, just enough. And I love this idea. This is the perfect picture of this when you think about safety at speed, right? And I ask people this all the time. I'm like, have you driven on an interstate lately? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, so you were driving 70, 75, 80 down the interstate. There's people driving the opposite direction, 75, 80 miles an hour. And yet it seems to happen in a relatively safe fashion. How does that happen? How do we get millions of automobiles on these systems moving independently at speed safely? And it's because of governance, right? So we've got rules in all kinds of places. There's rules and regulations for how the interstate should be constructed, and how quickly you can get off of an interstate and how you merge onto an interstate, what that looks like. So those are expected. So as long as those rules are followed, everybody knows that's how it works. And there's rules and regulations for the vehicles traveling on the interstate. And so you can see that when we've got these boundaries and we tell people, hey, the boundaries are set and the rules and regulations are set, you can now build and work within that framework as quickly as you want to. And so that's the beauty of building systems and governing things in an autonomous fashion. So the CAT framework plays throughout the entire life cycle as well. So when you look at it, you go, this idea of building categories of concern plays throughout the entire DevOps life cycle. This is the DevOps infinity loop that I've overlaid with the design thinking language, because I think that when we build things with the traditional DevOps lens, it does not lend itself quite the way that design thinking lends itself to being productized in our approach. But the idea is that we can define, and we're looking at what patterns to apply and what productization, and that when we ideate, we should be looking at how does this land on a specific category, and what should we be building, and what consumers are using as we prototype, and what linters and validation and automation can we put into our build process and implementation. Do we need a cab? You might. We look at it and go, if you've got highly sensitive data that if it were to be leaked, it could cause catastrophic disruption to your business, you go, that's something we might want to take a look at, and have somebody do a visual audit on before that goes into production. So we might have a process for a physical audit. And then there's the, how will my consumers learn, what is the infrastructure that's required? Is it being used in a finite number of consumers or an unknown number of consumers where we need elasticity built in? And then learning and reaching out to consumers and finding out how close we got, what we can do better, and then going back through the process. So categories change the entire life cycle of how you go about building. And by categorizing your API concerns and then changing what must be done based on that category, you are removing a lot of requirements for things that are benign and used internally, where you can allow them to move very quickly, and you're leaving that scrutiny on those processes that require scrutinization. And then this is a slide where we talk about how we approach it. So when we look at policies, the SDLC, and operations, these are all of the activities that we look at in this process. And we like to think of our approach to governance as a shift. We really look at security and governance in a shift left oriented way. And it's this idea that if we can shift left, if we can build things from a standards perspective to match our expectations of consumption, right, and the categories, then we can start to create systems that our developers can work within. So we can create our standards, we can create all of our risk management and our controls, and then we can build our development practices that have opinionated frameworks, right? So when we talk about things like, security practices, not just security practices as concept or as things that must be done, it's security practices that cover these principles like this, and those become the standard. And if you deviate from the standard, then you get to go through the gate. But if you don't deviate from the standard, you get to move fast. And this is the idea, is trying to move folks into standardized compliant processes. The idea that we've got not just reference architectures, but we've got reference implementations, so that if you can take provisioning tools and provision reference implementations that were provisioned in a correct fashion with the correct security, then we trust them. And we can also prove that they were built in the right fashion with automation. Therefore, things get increased and they go faster. So these are the concepts and the ideas of how to build development practices based on opinionated practices. So opinionated design, opinionated security, opinionated framework, opinionated architecture, opinionated code. All of those things need to be thought through, because the more opinionated we become, the easier it is for us to remain compliant and secure and move faster. And then when we get into development, we can now implement automation to help us build things more quickly by implementing scaffolding and those types of things. And also when we get into the DevOps cycles, we can start looking at automation to take those things that we pre-built and pre-approved and ensure that you use them without altering them. And so with all of these concepts, we're able to now ensure that governance is happening in a very automated fashion without having a lot of people involved with the process, which creates an enormous amount of efficiency. And then the last part of that is monitoring and detection and oversight, which are always necessary. And I think that that is an area where we see most companies are doing a yeoman's job of executing on their governance considerations. And those are the principles that I wanted to share with you today. And if you have any questions, I would love to entertain them.
Yeah, thank you, Lou. Yeah, we've had a few questions pop up from today's audience, and we have an attendee who's wondering, what's really the best way to begin creating a governance program?
Oh, great question. So, I mean, we're always going to come at this from the productized perspective. It says first start with, aligning the organization on the fact that you're trying to accelerate outcomes through data democratization and self-service products. So that would be number one. And then number two, I would look at, starting to create standards for security, for construction, and for categorization, and start there. And then you can start adding those layers of frameworks and automation and all of those things on top of that as you start to mature. So as long as you've started building things with the right mentality and the right structure, and you're not going to create this is the thing in API world that's terrible. It's breaking changes. We don't want to create breaking changes. So as long as you're doing things that don't create breaking changes, then you're in a good place.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we have an attendee who's curious to know if there's a difference in what you'd really recommend if they're only really focusing on building a program for internal APIs.
Oh, good question. I think everything I said before would really apply. So we're working with companies that have got thousands of internal developers, hundreds of internal teams. And when you think about the challenge, especially when we start looking at today's environment where we see so much offshoring going on, and you look at the fact that you're dealing with teams that are definitely not familiar with the implementation they're trying to integrate with, and they're not in the same facility even. And now with COVID and pandemic concerns, we're going to see this long-term effect of more people are working remotely anyway. So we're not working a lot face-to-face. So in my opinion, this idea of the API portal becoming that democratized data store and starting there is more relevant today than ever for internal organizations. And the need for that CAP framework and starting with standards, those things are there as well, because those same concerns that you have for internal developers are there for external developers. building things consistently so that they behave consistently. And so every time you have a customer, they're not relearning how to use your APIs. So having those standards and practices and securing them in a common fashion, all of those things would apply similarly. The big difference might be that you may give more information to those internal developers, telling them which team's building it, which data they're building it on top of, and contact information and things that would be relevant to them that would not be relevant outside the enterprise.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lou, for sharing these insights and answering these questions from our audience. And I also want to thank, of course, our attendees for spending.
I got one more question.
Oh, we did. Here. You're right. We did just get another question in. Yeah. So Lou, who is typically the stakeholder for who really holistically owns an API governance program?
So we've seen different stakeholders. We've seen the integration team own that. We've seen incredibly large enterprises who have API teams alongside of the integration team as a separate team. So they're saying we've got an integration team and we've got an API team. The thing that we like to see the most, because we love the idea that APIs are the fabric of the distributed economy, right? So we look at it and go, everything's distributed. APIs are the connectivity of that distributed world. So you're going to have to federate to be successful. So the idea that a team who doesn't have scope over some folks who might participate is troublesome. So I like the idea of having a center of enablement. And one of our teams calls theirs ACE. I love that. That's my favorite. It's the API Center of Enablement. And that team is the team that would be responsible for working across the organization and ensuring that your governance is implemented properly. And evolving it over time, reaching out to the teams that are participating for their insights and evolution of the process.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad we had a moment to answer that one. We have a couple more minutes left. I will just note one more question from our audience. And they're wondering, how can we convince the business that the organization needs an API platform? It sounds like in this case, the business doesn't have a use case yet, but as part of IT, we are convinced that we need an API. We are convinced that we need an API platform. Yeah.
What we found, and actually this is something that we've done with the folks at Google a lot, is going in and doing workshop with the business, marketing, and IT, and helping them to understand how companies that we work with are successfully using API programs, what value they're getting, and what that looks like, and bringing in those traditional product owners, right? The folks that own the different products in the organization, and having them all participate in that to understand, what are we doing right now? What capabilities do we need? How do those map up to what we're trying to do? How would an API program of democratized consumer independent APIs make a difference? And what I have found over and over again is that those sessions where we're presenting the art of the possible and we're having those real conversations with the organization about the problems they're trying to solve and how APIs really make a huge difference in the realization of that we walk away 100% of the time with the organization being locked in on where that value can be realized.
Great. Thank you. And just one last question to close out for today. I really appreciate these last ones coming in. But it sounds like we have an attendee wondering, from the API governance perspective, could you just touch up on any kind of API security aspect as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So API security and API governance from our perspective go hand in hand. They are definitely differing concerns, but they're interrelated concerns, because we can implement security into the governance process. So our standards and how we build APIs, the methods that we use and where we store, things like where our tokens are stored in the header, which would be encrypted versus in the body, where we're passing down authentication and authorization and how we're doing that. Those are standardized practices that we teach developers as a part of the governance process, but those also impact security tremendously. So when we can start to do things like that and build into our standards and our practices, things that would create secure practices, then all of a sudden we start to get really good at security. And, you know, the pre-built, predefined becomes a big part of that too. So building infrastructure, reference implementations, frameworks, scaffolding, all of those things, those are accelerators. Those do help you to build things that are highly available and performant and cohesive and work in the same fashion. But we can also, we also do bake security into that. We make sure that the security is implemented into that scaffolding in a recommended and a compliant fashion. So, man, this is such a powerful way to do things by joining your security concerns with your governance processes.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
I know we're going to just a couple minutes over, so please be sure to check your inbox for further resources, and of course we have recorded today's webinar, so we will be sending that to all registrants and attendees. And if you didn't get your question answered, we'll definitely be in touch so we can kind of continue discussions around your API strategy. So again, thank you so much to Lou for presenting today, and really appreciate all of you for spending time with the PK team.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.